The artist's paintings are burned in front of everyone's eyes, but his work becomes a voice of resistance. Subscribe, share this video, and write in the comments where you are watching this from. The fountain sat at the heart of the square, a timeless centerpiece that seemed to draw the pulse of the city around it. On sunny days, its gentle streams of water sparkled like liquid crystal, catching the eyes of children who chased pigeons nearby and adults seeking solace in its soothing rhythm. Vendors lined the edges of the square, peddling everything from ice cream to trinkets, their cheerful calls blending into the hum of the crowd. It was here, nestled on the stone-paved corner of the fountain, that Marcus set up his humble workspace every day. His tools were simple, yet essential. A folding easel, a battered metal stool, and a worn leather satchel filled with charcoal, pencils, and vibrant paints. Marcus had painted by this fountain for years, his art becoming as much a fixture of the square as the fountain itself. His customers ranged from tourists wanting quick sketches to locals who treasured his portraits as cherished keepsakes. His steady hand and keen eye could capture the soul of his subjects, bringing a warmth to his work that felt almost tangible. That morning, as the sun climbed over the rooftops and spilled golden light onto the square, Marcus was immersed in his work. A woman in her 70s sat before him, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon as Marcus sketched her features with swift, confident strokes. Her name was Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher who had spent most of her life in the city. She spoke softly as Marcus worked, her voice carrying a faint tremor of nostalgia. "You know," she said, her eyes glinting with the memories she recounted, "I used to bring my students to this square. We'd sit right over there under that big oak tree, and they'd sketch the fountain. None of them were as talented as you, of course." Marcus smiled, without lifting his eyes from the page. "I'm sure they had their own kind of talent, Mrs. Eleanor. Every hand sees the world differently." Eleanor chuckled. "Perhaps. But you've got a gift, Marcus. You make us look better than we are." Marcus paused, meeting her gaze. "I just try to see what's already there." The square was bustling as usual, with children's laughter mingling with the clatter of footsteps and the chatter of passers-by. Yet, amidst the lively commotion, Marcus felt the weight of a watchful presence. His eyes flicked up briefly, and there, at the far edge of the square, stood Officer Bradley. The white police officer's imposing figure loomed like a shadow among the vibrant scene. Marcus wasn't new to Bradley's gaze. It was the kind that lingered just long enough to unsettle, an unspoken warning that seemed to hang in the air. Bradley had patrolled the square for as long as Marcus could remember. He was the kind of officer who prided himself on enforcing order, though his version of order often carried a selective bias. Over the years, Marcus had learned to avoid direct confrontation, but today Bradley's scrutiny felt heavier, more deliberate. The officer's hand rested on his belt, near his radio, as if ready to call for backup at the slightest provocation. Marcus forced himself to refocus. Eleanor's face deserved his full attention, not the cold presence looming in the periphery. He resumed sketching, letting the rhythm of his pencil strokes soothe his unease. As the session wrapped up, Marcus handed Eleanor her portrait. Her eyes widened as she took in the drawing. "It's lovely," she murmured. "You've captured me better than I deserve." "You deserve every line," Marcus replied, his voice soft yet firm. "Thank you for letting me draw you." Eleanor pressed a bill into his hand, but Marcus hesitated. "This is too much," he said. "Nonsense," she replied, closing his hand around the money. "Your work is worth far more than you charge." She left with a gentle smile, the portrait clutched to her chest, and Marcus tucked the money into his satchel. As he began packing up for the day, the feeling of being watched crept over him again. He glanced up, and there was Bradley, still standing at the edge of the square, his gaze fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't over. The shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the cobblestones as Marcus folded his easel and slung his satchel over his shoulder. The square was quieter now, the crowd thinning as vendors began to pack up their carts. Marcus walked past the fountain, the gentle splash of water breaking the silence, and headed toward the narrow alley that led to his apartment. He couldn't shake the weight of Bradley's stare, the unspoken threat it carried. Inside his small, cluttered studio, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The walls were lined with his work, portraits of people from all walks of life, each one a testament to his connection with his subjects. Yet tonight, as he gazed at them, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. The presence of Bradley had unsettled something deep within him, a reminder that even in the beauty of his art, there were forces ready to tear it down. As the city settled into the quiet hum of evening, Marcus sat at his desk, pencil in hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. His fingers hovered over the page, but no lines came. For the first time in a long while, the blankness felt heavier than the potential it usually held. Tomorrow, he thought, setting the pencil aside, tomorrow will be better. But as he lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of his apartment, Marcus couldn't shake the sense that tomorrow might bring something far worse. The square was alive with its usual energy the next morning. The scent of roasted coffee and fresh pastries wafted through the air as vendors set up their carts. Children darted between benches, their laughter ringing out like wind chimes. Marcus arrived early, eager to find solace in his art after the unease of the previous day. He unfolded his easel, carefully arranged his paints and pencils, and prepared for the first sketch of the day. The fountain's soothing rhythm offered a welcome distraction, its cascading water masking the distant chatter of the growing crowd. Marcus's first customer, a young woman with auburn curls and a bright smile, sat patiently as he began her portrait. She was a tourist, marveling at the charm of the city and thrilled to take home a piece of its character through Marcus's art. Her enthusiasm lifted his spirits, and he lost himself in the steady movement of his pencil across the page. But that tranquility didn't last long. Out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching. Officer Bradley's deliberate, heavy steps echoed against the cobblestones, cutting through the square's light-hearted atmosphere. Marcus's hand faltered for a moment, his pencil pausing mid-stroke, before he forced himself to focus on the drawing. His heart sank as he felt the officer's presence loom closer. Bradley came to a stop a few feet away, his shadow stretching across Marcus's easel. The young woman in the chair shifted uncomfortably, glancing up at the officer, but Bradley's gaze was fixed solely on Marcus. "Busy morning?" Bradley asked, his tone carrying an edge that immediately put Marcus on alert. Marcus kept his voice steady. "It's a good day for art, officer. People enjoy seeing themselves through a different lens." Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms. "Through your lens, you mean? You've been setting up here a lot lately, haven't you?" Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders tighten, but he maintained his composure. I've been here for years, sir, just doing my work." Bradley leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering but not losing its sharpness. "Doing your work, or running a business without a permit?" The young woman stood abruptly, her face flushed with discomfort. "I think I'll come back later," she mumbled, grabbing her bag and hurrying away. Marcus reached out to stop her, but she was already gone. Bradley watched her leave, then turned back to Marcus with a smirk. "Look at that. You're scaring off customers now." Marcus swallowed hard, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm not running a business, I'm an artist. People give what they want in exchange for my work." "Sounds like a business to me," Bradley said, his smirk fading into a cold glare. "And it sounds like you're taking up public space without permission." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the officer's raised voice. Vendors paused their work, and passers-by slowed to watch the confrontation unfold. Marcus noticed familiar faces in the crowd, people who had sat for him, who had admired his work. Their presence gave him a flicker of courage, but Bradley's imposing figure and relentless tone pressed heavily on him. "I've never caused trouble here," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "This square belongs to the city. I'm just sharing my art with the people who live here." Bradley's expression darkened. The square belongs to the city, and the city has rules, rules that apply to everyone, including you. Without waiting for a response, Bradley stepped forward and grabbed one of Marcus's completed sketches, a detailed portrait of a young boy holding a sunflower. He held it up for the crowd to see before crumpling it in his fist. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A woman in the crowd called out, "That's uncalled for!" But Bradley ignored her. He turned to Marcus, his voice cold and commanding. "Pack up your things and leave. Now." Marcus's hands clenched at his sides, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He wanted to protest, to stand his ground, but he knew where that path would lead. His whole life had taught him the danger of resisting authority, even when it was unjust. "I'll leave," Marcus said quietly, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. "But there's no need to destroy my work." Bradley ignored him, tossing the crumpled sketch onto the ground. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he reached for the stack of Marcus's finished portraits and began to tear them apart. The crowd murmured in disbelief, but no one dared to step forward. "Stop this!" a voice shouted. It was Eleanor, the elderly woman whose portrait Marcus had drawn the day before. She pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face flushed with indignation. "These aren't just pieces of paper. They're memories. They're people's stories." Bradley barely spared her a glance. "Stay back, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Eleanor shot back. "Marcus's art is part of this square, part of this city. You can't just—" "Enough," Bradley barked, his hand moving to his radio. "If you want to make this official, I'll call for backup." The threat hung heavy in the air, silencing Eleanor and the rest of the crowd. Marcus felt a hollow ache in his chest as he watched Bradley gather his remaining work into a pile. With a spark from a lighter, the officer set the stack ablaze. The flames licked hungrily at the paper, turning vibrant portraits into ash within moments. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the cheerful atmosphere of the square now replaced by an oppressive weight. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing between disbelief and despair. When the fire had burned out, Bradley dusted his hands and looked at Marcus. "This is your last warning. Next time you'll leave in cuffs." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Marcus and the crowd behind. The square seemed to hold its breath, the silence deafening. Slowly the onlookers began to disperse, their murmurs of outrage and sorrow fading into the distance. Marcus bent down, sifting through the ashes of his work. The charred remnants grumbled in his hands, leaving dark smudges on his skin. Eleanor knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This isn't right," she said softly. "You don't deserve this." Marcus didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the blackened ground, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he stood, brushing the ash from his hands. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor." Without another word, he gathered his supplies and walked away, the eyes of the remaining onlookers following him in silent sympathy. The fountain, once a source of peace, now felt like a place of loss. Marcus didn't look back. The walk back to his studio felt endless, each step heavier than the last. The ashes of his destroyed artwork still clung to Marcus's fingertips, a grim reminder of what had just unfolded at the square. He had always known the weight of being seen as an outsider in his own city, but today that weight had crushed him. His studio sat on the second floor of a narrow, aging brick building, tucked away in an alley that smelled of damp stone and coffee from the cafe downstairs. Normally, stepping into this space brought Marcus a sense of peace. The walls, covered in years of his work, stood as a testament to his journey, a mosaic of faces, emotions, and moments he had captured in his art. Today, though, the room felt suffocating, the vibrant colors of his paintings dulled by the memory of flames. Marcus dropped his satchel onto the floor and sank into the chair by his desk. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a half-finished canvas propped against the wall. It was a portrait of a child holding a sunflower, the same subject as one of the sketches Bradley had destroyed. The sight of it brought a sharp pang to his chest. He had planned to finish it that evening, but now his hands felt paralyzed, as if the act of creating had been stolen from him. He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The faint sounds of the city filtered through the cracked window, the hum of cars, distant laughter, a dog barking. It all felt disconnected, like a world he no longer belonged to. Memories began to surface, unbidden but relentless. He was a boy again, sitting on the floor of his childhood home, crayons scattered around him as he drew on scraps of paper. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Marcus, you see the world differently. Never let anyone tell you that's a bad thing." She had been his first supporter, his anchor. She worked long hours as a nurse, but she always found time to encourage his art, buying him sketchbooks and colored pencils, even when money was tight. Her voice had been a constant reassurance, a shield against the harshness of the world. But even her voice couldn't protect him from everything. He remembered the first time he realized the world didn't see him the way his mother did. He had been 10, walking home from school with a sketchbook under his arm. A group of older boys stopped him, sneering as they flipped through his drawings. "What kind of boy draws flowers and faces?" one of them had jeered, tearing a page from the book and crumpling it. "You're nothing but a freak." The memory hit him like a wave, the sting of their words as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. It was a wound he had carried for years, one that had driven him to prove them wrong through his art. But now, after Bradley's destruction, that old pain resurfaced, whispering the same cruel doubts. A sharp knock at the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. He hesitated, his heart racing. He wasn't ready to face anyone, but the knocking persisted. "Marcus, it's Eleanor," came the familiar voice, muffled through the door. "Please let me in." Marcus sighed, pushing himself out of the chair. He opened the door to find the elderly woman standing there, her face lined with concern. In her hands, she held a brown paper bag. "I brought you something to eat," she said, stepping inside before he could protest. She placed the bag on his desk and turned to face him. "You look like you haven't eaten all day." Marcus managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Eleanor. You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," she said firmly. "What happened today was wrong, Marcus. You shouldn't have to go through that." Marcus sat back down, running a hand over his face. I don't know what to do. It feels like everything I've worked for is gone. Eleanor pulled up a stool and sat across from him. It's not gone, she said softly. Your art is still here, Marcus, and so are the people who care about it. He shook his head. Bradley's not going to stop. He made that pretty clear. Then we won't let him win. Eleanor said, her voice steady with conviction. You've touched so many lives with your art. You've brought joy, hope, and beauty to this city. People see that, Marcus, and they'll stand with you. Marcus looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a hint of doubt, but he found none. Her unwavering belief in him stirred something deep within, a faint ember of hope, buried beneath the ashes of the day. Later that evening, as the city quieted into the hush of night, Marcus sat alone at his desk. The brown paper bag Eleanor had brought still sat unopened. He stared at the blank sheet of paper before him, his pencil hovering in his hand. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Bradley's sneer, the flames devouring his work, Eleanor's determined words. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Slowly, he began to draw, his hand moving almost instinctively. The lines were shaky at first, but they grew steadier with each stroke. He wasn't sure what he was creating, only that he needed to. The act of drawing felt like reclaiming a part of himself that had been stolen. By the time he set the pencil down, the first hints of dawn were creeping through the window. On the paper before him was the faint outline of a hand holding a charred flower. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Miles away, the city began to stir, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in the heart of a small studio. The cafe on the corner of Main Street buzzed with the morning rush, the rich aroma of coffee mingling with the chatter of patrons. Eleanor sat at her usual table by the window, a steaming cup of tea before her. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her phone, rereading the posts she'd seen last night. Photos of Marcus's burned artwork and videos of the confrontation with Officer Bradley had spread like wildfire. Hashtags like Justice for Marcus and Art Eyes Resistance were trending locally, and comments poured in from people expressing their outrage. The community was waking up to the injustice, and Eleanor, though fueled by righteous anger, felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She couldn't let this moment pass without action. The cafe door jingled as it opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was David, a high school art teacher and longtime admirer of Marcus's work. Eleanor waved him over, and he approached with a curious expression. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, pulling out a chair. "What's got you so intense this early?" She slid her phone across the table, showing him one of the videos. He watched in silence, his jaw tightening with every second. When it ended, he let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "This is infuriating," David said. "Marcus doesn't deserve this." "None of us do," Eleanor replied. "And we're not going to let it stand. We have to do something." David leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Like what? File a complaint? Write an open letter? Bradley's been pulling stunts like this for years. Nothing ever sticks." "Nope. This time," Eleanor said firmly. "This time the whole city's watching. People are already talking, and if we move quickly, we can turn that momentum into something real." David hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, what do you have in mind?" Eleanor's eyes lit with determination. "We'll organize a public art exhibit right in the square where Bradley humiliated Marcus. We'll show everyone the beauty of his work and remind them why it matters. And we won't stop there. We'll invite others to contribute, kids, adults, anyone who's been inspired by Marcus. It'll be a statement that no one can ignore." David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "It's ambitious, but you're right. It could work. People love Marcus. If we give them a way to show it, they'll show up." "Then let's get started," Eleanor said, her voice resolute. "We'll need volunteers, materials, and time, but we don't have much of the last one. I want this to happen by the end of the week." They spent the next hour drafting a plan. David offered to involve his students, who adored Marcus and often talked about how much his art inspired them. Eleanor reached out to local business owners who might be willing to donate supplies or space. By the time they left the cafe, they had a growing list of contacts and a spark of hope. That evening, Marcus sat in his studio, staring at the half-finished drawing from the night before. He had barely touched it since the early hours of the morning, his mind clouded with doubt. What was the point? He could sketch and paint all he wanted, but it wouldn't change the way people like Bradley saw him. It wouldn't erase the ashes on the cobblestones or the humiliation in the square. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. This time, it wasn't Eleanor. It was David, holding a portfolio under one arm and a determined look on his face. "Marcus?" David said, stepping inside before Marcus could protest. "We need to talk." Marcus gestured vaguely toward the chair by the desk. "What's this about?" David placed the portfolio on the desk and opened it, revealing a stack of papers. Sketches, paintings, letters. Marcus recognized some of the drawings. They were from David's students, vibrant and full of life. "They made these for you," David said. "When they heard what happened, they wanted to show their support. And it's not just them. Eleanor and I are organizing an exhibit in the square, a way to show the city what your art means to us." Marcus stared at the drawings, his throat tightening. He picked up one of the sketches, a crude but heartfelt portrait of him, smiling as he worked. Beneath it, the words, "Thank you, Marcus," were scrawled in colorful letters. "I don't know what to say," Marcus murmured. "This is, a lot." David leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Say yes. Say you'll let us do this. People care about you, Marcus. They see the value in your work, even if Bradley doesn't. This is a chance to remind everyone what art can do." Marcus hesitated, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. "And what happens when Bradley shows up again? When he tears this down too?" "Then we'll rebuild it," David said, "and again until he realizes he can't win. This isn't just about you, Marcus. It's about all of us." Marcus looked at the sketches again, his fingers tracing the lines of a sunflower drawn by a child. The faint ember of hope from the night before flickered brighter. Maybe, just maybe, this could make a difference. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Over the next few days, the city came alive with preparations. Volunteers gathered in Eleanor's living room, organizing submissions and brainstorming ideas. Local businesses donated supplies, paints, brushes, canvases, and some even offered to sponsor the event. Social media buzzed with excitement, the hashtag growing more widespread. On the day of the exhibit, the square transformed. Large easels were set up in a semicircle around the fountain, displaying prints of Marcus's surviving works alongside new pieces contributed by the community. Children brought their own drawings, taping them to makeshift walls, while adults shared stories about how Marcus's art had touched their lives. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, greeting attendees with her warm, encouraging smile. David directed his students, who worked tirelessly to hang pieces and organize the displays. And finally, as the sun began to set, Marcus arrived. He paused at the edge of the square, taking in the scene. The crowd was larger than he had expected, a sea of faces lit by the golden glow of dusk. His heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. As he stepped into the square, people began to notice him. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus's cheeks flushed, and he raised a hand in acknowledgement, unsure of what to say. Eleanor appeared beside him, her smile radiant. "This is all for you," she said. "Take it in." Marcus did. For the first time in days, the weight on his chest began to lift. Maybe there was still hope after all. The air was filled with anticipation as the evening sun dipped below the rooftops, casting the square in a warm orange glow. People gathered around the fountain, their faces illuminated by the soft fading light. Music played from a small speaker someone had brought, a gentle melody that blended seamlessly with the murmur of the crowd. The square, once marked by the sting of injustice, now felt like a place of solidarity and hope. Marcus stood in the center of it all, taking in the scene. He had never seen the square so alive, not even on the busiest market days. Large prints of his previous work, saved by those who had cherished his art, stood proudly on easels. Around them were new pieces, some by local artists, others by children whose drawings burst with color and energy. People moved from one easel to the next, admiring the variety, sharing stories, and adding their voices to the collective tribute. Eleanor approached Marcus, her face glowing with pride. "Look at what you've done," she said softly. "Look at how you've brought all of us together." Marcus swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. "I didn't do this alone," he replied. "All of you. You made this happen." Eleanor smiled, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We believed in you, Marcus, and this," she gestured to the crowd, "is what happens when people believe in each other." As the sky darkened, small lanterns were lit, casting a gentle, flickering light over the artwork. The fountain sparkled in the glow, and the gentle splash of water became a soothing backdrop to the event. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air, while families and friends gathered around the easels, admiring the art on display. David, the high school art teacher, stepped up onto the edge of the fountain and called for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice carrying over the square. "We are here to celebrate Marcus, his art, and what it means to our community. Art has the power to bring us together, to make us see the world through someone else's eyes, and Marcus has done that for all of us." Applause erupted from the crowd, and Marcus felt his cheeks flush. David gestured for Marcus to join him, and the crowd's applause grew louder as Marcus climbed up beside him. David handed him the microphone, and Marcus hesitated for a moment. He had never been one for public speaking, but he preferred to let his art do the talking. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, all of them filled with hope and encouragement, he knew he had to find the words. "Thank you," he began, his voice shaky at first. "Thank you all for being here, for standing with me, for believing in me, even when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." He paused, taking a deep breath. "What happened in this square a few days ago, it hurt. It made me question my place in this city, my right to be here, to create. But seeing all of you tonight, seeing the way you've come together, it reminds me that art isn't just about the person who makes it. It's about all of us. It's about connection, about sharing something real. Marcus glanced down at the children's drawings, their vibrant colors glowing under the lantern light. These kids, these drawings, they remind me why I started doing this in the first place, because the world can be harsh, but art can make it beautiful. And as long as we keep creating, keep sharing, keep standing up for each other, we'll be okay. The crowd erupted in applause once more, and Marcus handed the microphone back to David. He stepped down from the fountain, his heart pounding, and Eleanor was there to meet him, her eyes misty with tears. "You did good, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did." As the applause died down, people began to gather closer, many of them wanting to speak to Marcus, to thank him or share their own stories. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. He listened as people told him how his art had touched their lives, how a portrait he had drawn had become a cherished keepsake, how his work had inspired someone's child to take up drawing, how his presence in the square had brought light to their days. Suddenly, a group of children ran up to Marcus, each of them holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Marcus, can you help us draw?" one of them asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Marcus smiled, kneeling down to their level. "Of course. Let's see what you've got." The children gathered around, and Marcus took out a pencil, showing them how to add shading to their drawings, how to bring depth to their simple sketches. They listened intently, their eyes shining with curiosity, and Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose that he had almost forgotten. As he worked with the children, a hush fell over the square. Marcus looked up, and his heart skipped a beat. Officer Bradley stood at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. For a moment, the energy in the square seemed to shift, tension rippling through the air like an electric current. Bradley stepped forward, the crowd parting to let him through. Marcus rose to his feet, his jaw tightening, his eyes meeting Bradley's. He could feel Eleanor and David move closer, their presence a silent show of support. The crowd watched, breath held, waiting to see what would happen. Bradley stopped a few feet away from Marcus, his eyes scanning the artwork on display. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze lingering on the children's drawings, the prints of Marcus's burned work, the portraits that had been saved by the community. Finally, Bradley spoke, his voice low but clear. "I was wrong." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Marcus blinked, taken aback. Bradley continued, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "I overstepped. I let my biases guide my actions, and I hurt you. I hurt this community, and for that, I'm sorry." Marcus stared at him, struggling to process the words. He had never imagined that Bradley would apologize, let alone in front of the entire community. The officer's expression was guarded, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that Marcus couldn't ignore. The crowd was silent, waiting for Marcus's response. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could feel the anger, the hurt, still lingering inside him. But he also felt the hope, the sense of unity that this evening had brought. "Thank you," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "I appreciate your words, Officer Bradley. But more than that, I hope we can learn from this. All of us." Bradley nodded, a hint of relief crossing his features. He turned and walked away, the crowd parting once again to let him through. Slowly, the tension in the square began to ease, the murmurs fading into a sense of quiet resolution. Eleanor placed a hand on Marcus's arm, her eyes filled with pride. "You handled that beautifully," she whispered. Marcus exhaled, the tension in his shoulders releasing. I hope it makes a difference," he said, It already has, David added, stepping up beside them. Tonight, you reminded everyone of what matters, and that's a start. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations, laughter, and art. Marcus spent time with the children, helping them add final touches to their drawings. He spoke with parents, teachers, old friends, and even strangers who had come to show their support. The square, once a place of humiliation and loss, had been transformed into a place of hope, of resilience, of community. As the night grew late and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Marcus found himself standing by the fountain, the lanterns casting a soft glow over the water. He looked out at the square, at the people still gathered in small groups, their voices low and content. He had come here every day for years, sharing his art with the city, hoping to bring a little beauty to the world. But tonight, he realized, it wasn't just about what he gave, it was about what the city gave back. It was about connection, about standing together, about finding hope in each other. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he truly belonged. The morning of the hearing was gray and still, as if the entire city held its breath. Marcus stood in front of the mirror in his small studio, adjusting his collar. His reflection looked back at him, tired but resolute. Today wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for every artist, every person who had felt voiceless under the weight of power. Eleanor had called him the night before, her voice filled with encouragement. "You're ready, Marcus," she'd said. "This is your time to speak." The hearing was held at City Hall, a place Marcus had always associated with bureaucracy and distance, where decisions were made behind closed doors, away from the people they affected. Today, though, the doors were open, and Marcus walked in with his head held high, Eleanor by his side. The hall was packed. Rows of wooden benches were filled with members of the community, teachers, artists, parents, children, all of them there for Marcus. He saw David with a group of his students, each of them wearing T-shirts they had painted in Marcus's honor. He saw familiar faces from the square, the people who had cheered for him, who had shared in his struggle and his triumph. At the front of the room, a long table was set up for the officials overseeing the hearing. Officer Bradley sat at a smaller table to the side, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed ahead. He looked different, smaller somehow, without the uniform's imposing authority. Marcus took a seat beside Eleanor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his heart pounding. The proceedings began with formalities, introductions, statements of purpose, a review of the incident that had brought them here. Marcus listened as the city official leading the hearing summarized Bradley's actions at the square, the confrontation, the destruction of Marcus's work, the complaints filed by witnesses. It was strange, hearing his life reduced to bullet points and legal language, but Marcus kept his eyes focused, refusing to be intimidated. After the official spoke, Bradley was given the floor. He stood, clearing his throat, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before shifting away. "Where is the demon hive?" "I won't deny what happened," Bradley began, his voice measured. "I let my frustration and my biases get the better of me. I overstepped my authority and I acted out of line. I recognize that what I did wasn't just wrong, it was an abuse of power. I want to apologize to Marcus and to this community for the harm I caused." A murmur ran through the room, but Marcus remained still, his expression unreadable. He could hear the sincerity in Bradley's voice, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't erase what had happened. They wouldn't bring back the hours, the effort, the emotion he had poured into his work. The official turned to Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, you have the floor." Eleanor gave Marcus a reassuring nod, and Marcus rose from his seat, his heart pounding in his ears. He stepped up to the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I'm not here just for myself. I'm here for every artist, every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of authority." He paused, his gaze shifting to the community members gathered in support. "A few days ago, I stood in the square where I've been painting for years. I watched my work, the work I'd poured my heart into, be destroyed. And in that moment, I felt like I had lost something that mattered deeply to me. I felt like my voice had been silenced." Marcus turned his gaze to Bradley, who sat, his eyes fixed on the table before him. "But what I've realized since then is that my voice isn't just mine. It belongs to the people who see my art, who find something meaningful in it. It belongs to the children who draw beside me, who see the world in colors and shapes. It belongs to this community." He looked back at the officials, his voice growing stronger. "Art isn't a business. It isn't something that can be measured by permits or licenses. It's a way for us to connect, to share our stories, to see each other. And when that's taken away, we lose more than just a painting or a sketch. We lose a part of ourselves." Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every person hanging on his words. He took a deep breath, his voice softening. "I don't want Officer Bradley to lose his job. I want him to understand what he took from me, from all of us. I want him to see that what happened wasn't just about enforcing a rule. It was about deciding whose voice matters and whose doesn't. And that's something we need to change." He stepped back from the podium, his hands trembling slightly, and returned to his seat. Eleanor reached over, squeezing his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "You spoke beautifully," she whispered. The officials conferred for a few moments, their voices low, before the lead official addressed the room. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus, for your powerful words. We have heard both sides today, and we recognize the impact of Officer Bradley's actions. It is clear that a formal apology alone will not suffice. Therefore, Officer Bradley will be placed on probation and will undergo mandatory training on community engagement and bias. Additionally, we are committed to working with local artists to ensure that public spaces remain accessible for creative expression." A wave of relief washed over Marcus. It wasn't perfect, it wouldn't undo the harm, but it was a step forward. Acknowledgement. Change. The officials called the hearing to a close, and the room erupted in applause. People stood, clapping and cheering, their faces alight with hope. Marcus felt Eleanor's arms wrap around him in a tight hug, her laughter filled with joy. David and his students rushed forward, their faces beaming. "You did it, Marcus," David said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You made them listen." Marcus smiled, his eyes misty. "We all did. This was never just about me." Bradley stood up from his table, glancing at Marcus before walking over. There was a moment of hesitation, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, Bradley extended his hand. "Marcus, I know it's going to take more than words, but I truly am sorry. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hope, in time, you'll be able to forgive me." Marcus looked at the outstretched hand, then at Bradley's face. He could see the struggle there, the vulnerability. Slowly, he reached out and shook Bradley's hand. "I hope we can both learn from this," Marcus said, his voice steady. Bradley nodded and then turned, leaving the hall. As he walked away, Marcus felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't complete, but it was a start, a small step toward something better. The rest of the day was a blur of congratulations, of hugs and handshakes, of people thanking Marcus for standing up, for speaking out. As the sun began to set, Marcus found himself back at the square, the fountain's gentle splash filling the air. The square was empty now, the easels and lanterns packed away, but the energy of the night before still lingered. Marcus set up his easel, the familiar routine grounding him. He took out a fresh canvas, his fingers brushing over its surface. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. The laughter of children, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He opened his eyes, picked up his brush, and began to paint. This time, he painted the square, not as it was, but as he saw it, filled with people, with color, with hope. He painted Eleanor, her face lined with determination. He painted David and his students, their hands raised in celebration. He painted Bradley, not as an antagonist, but as a man capable of change. And as the colors came together on the canvas, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. Art, he realized, wasn't just about beauty. It was about truth, about connection, about resilience. It was about taking the pain and turning it into something that mattered, something that could be shared. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus worked, his heart light, his soul unburdened. He painted not just for himself, but for everyone who had stood by him, for everyone who believed in the power of art to heal, to unite, to transform. And in that moment, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. The sun rose slowly over the city, painting the sky in warm shades of pink and gold, casting a soft glow over the streets below. Marcus stood at the window of his studio, watching as the light poured over the rooftops and touched the edges of the fountain square. Today felt different. A new beginning filled with possibilities. He let out a slow breath, his heart swelling with a sense of renewal. Today was the opening day of Marcus's first personal exhibit, a showcase he had never thought possible until now. The community's outpouring of support had turned the idea of a simple exhibit into something far greater. It was going to be held in the town's main gallery, a space that Marcus had always thought was beyond his reach, reserved for the well-established, the celebrated. But here he was, on the brink of realizing a dream that once seemed so distant. Eleanor had called him the night before to remind him of the schedule, her voice brimming with pride. "Marcus, you deserve every bit of this," she had said. "This is your time to shine." He couldn't help but feel humbled by her words, by everything that had happened to bring him here. The gallery sat in the heart of the city, its facade elegant and inviting, large windows allowing passers-by a glimpse of the art inside. As Marcus approached, he felt a flutter of nerves, an anxious excitement that settled into his chest. He paused for a moment before stepping inside, taking in the sight of his work displayed so prominently, his name written in elegant script on a sign near the entrance. The Voice of the City, an exhibition by Marcus Johnson. The gallery buzzed with life. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers walked through the space, their faces lit with admiration as they took in Marcus's work. There were the familiar portraits he had painted over the years, faces of people who had sat by the fountain, those who had trusted him to capture something honest about them. There were also new works, pieces that Marcus had created in the wake of everything that had happened, filled with the rawness of his journey, pain, resilience, hope. At the center of the exhibit stood his latest creation, the voice of the city. It was the piece he had been working on since the day of the hearing. The painting depicted the square, filled with people standing together, their hands linked in a show of unity. In the background was the fountain, its water cascading gently, a symbol of the constancy that connected everyone who gathered there. Marcus had painted Eleanor at the forefront, her face glowing with determination. Beside David and his students, their hands raised in celebration. People gathered around the painting, their voices hushed with awe. Marcus watched from a distance, feeling both vulnerable and proud. This painting wasn't just about him, it was about all of them, about a community that had come together to fight for what was right. It was about the power of connection, of standing up, of refusing to be silenced. "Marcus!" A familiar voice called out, and he turned to see David approaching, a wide smile on his face. Behind him were a few of his students, each of them carrying a bouquet of flowers. "We wanted to congratulate you properly," David said, handing Marcus a bouquet of sunflowers. "You did it, man. You really did." Marcus accepted the flowers, his throat tightening with emotion. "I couldn't have done any of this without all of you," he said, his voice thick. "This isn't just my win, it's ours." David nodded, his eyes misty. "Well, we're all so damn proud of you. The kids talk about you every day at school. They see you as a role model." One of the students, a young girl named Emma, stepped forward, her eyes wide as she looked up at Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, we're doing a project about our heroes in art class," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I chose you." Marcus felt his heart swell. "Oh." Tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He knelt down to her level, his voice soft. "Thank you, Emma. That means more to me than I can say." Emma smiled, her cheeks flushing pink, and Marcus stood, looking back at David. "I think I might have to come by and see these projects," Marcus said, his tone light. "Maybe give some feedback." David grinned. "You're always welcome. The kids would love that." Eleanor appeared beside them then, her smile as bright as the sunflowers Marcus held. "Look at this place," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's all you, Marcus. You've brought so much light into this world." Marcus looked around the gallery, taking in the faces of those gathered. The laughter, the quiet conversations, the warmth that seemed to fill every corner of the space. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You were the one who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with tears, and she reached out, wrapping Marcus in a tight hug. "Always, Marcus," she whispered. "Always." The day went on, the gallery bustling with visitors, people coming in waves to see the exhibit, to speak to Marcus, to share their stories of how his art had touched their lives. Marcus felt like he was floating, the joy and gratitude lifting him higher with every passing moment. He moved through the gallery, speaking to each person who approached, listening to their stories, their words of encouragement. Near the end of the day, as the light outside began to soften with the coming dusk, Marcus found himself standing by the window, looking out at the fountain square. It was quiet now, the water shimmering in the golden light of sunset, the cobblestones glistening. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a deep understanding that this journey, as painful as it had been, had led him to this moment. He turned back to the gallery, his eyes landing on the children gathered around a table, sketching their own interpretations of the fountain, their faces filled with concentration and joy. He walked over, kneeling beside one of the boys, a young child with dark, curly hair who was carefully drawing the outline of the fountain. "Can I help?" Marcus asked gently, and the boy looked up, his eyes widening with excitement. "Yeah," the boy said, handing Marcus a pencil. "I'm trying to make the water look like it's moving." Marcus smiled, taking the pencil and showing the boy how to add soft, flowing lines to give the illusion of movement. "Just like that," he said. "See how it makes it feel alive?" The boy nodded, his face lighting up. "Wow, that looks so cool. Thank you, Mr. Marcus." Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of fulfillment that was deeper than anything he had ever known. "Any time, buddy," he said. "You keep drawing, okay? You're really good." As the evening wore on and the gallery began to quiet down, Marcus found himself standing in front of the voice of the city once more. The painting seemed to glow in the soft light, the colors vibrant, the faces alive with emotion. He felt Eleanor step up beside him, her eyes on the painting. "What's next for you, Marcus?" she asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity. Marcus thought for a moment, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "I want to keep painting," he said. "But more than that, I want to teach. I want to help kids find their voices through art, the way I found mine. I want to make sure that no one ever feels like their voice doesn't matter." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. "That sounds perfect," she said. "You're going to change so many lives, Marcus." Marcus looked at her, his heart filled with hope and determination. "Maybe, but for now, I'm just going to keep doing what I love." Eleanor nodded, her smile radiant. "And that's more than enough." The gallery slowly emptied, the visitors trickling out into the night, their voices fading into the soft hum of the city. Marcus stood by the door, saying goodbye to each person, thanking them for coming, for sharing in this moment. When the last visitor had left, Marcus turned back to the gallery, taking in the sight of his work one last time. He walked to the center of the room, his fingers brushing over the edge of one of the canvases, a sense of peace settling over him. This was his story, a story of resilience, of hope, of finding his place in the world, and it was only just beginning. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretched out before him, alive with possibility. The fountain square was bathed in moonlight, the water shimmering, and Marcus took a deep breath, his heart swelling with gratitude. This was his city, his community, and his voice would always be a part of it, and with every stroke of his brush, every line he drew, he would continue to tell the story of hope, of connection, of the beauty that could be found in every face, in every moment, in every part of the world. A new dawn had begun, and Marcus was ready to embrace it, one painting at a time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking narratives. Share this video with someone who might find it meaningful, and explore our channel for other captivating stories. See you in the next one.